So you can go up, find your presentation. Oh yeah, you do want that, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Do you want me to stand or am I okay here?
You can do whatever makes you feel most comfortable.
What's easier? There we go. Point.
And so you'll want to go back to Zoom to share this.
Okay. So Zoom,
Little green button, yeah.
share. It's better to the PowerPoint of the desktop.
A PowerPoint.
Okay. Share.
And then you can make this to a slideshow for me.
Oh. From the start.
Perfect.
Continue to share.
There's been some update on our operating system recently. It's made everything terrible.
Excellent. Okay, so this project was actually for a non-history class. It was for social movements and political activism. And this project was kind of our big semester project that we were focusing on through the whole year. My overall project was LGBTQ kind of movements in China, and focusing on part one was kind of the history of the LGBTQ movement overall. Part two was a case study on different individuals within that movement at a specific time. And then part three is where that movement is today, and it's kind of like methodology and rhetoric that it uses. I'll be presenting part two for you guys. This is San Guanjingbei Ren, which means three transgender people. We will be looking at three different transgender individuals in the 1900s, first half of the 1900s. So for starting off, we kind of need to discuss where China sits with transgenderism kind of in general, because they go off an entirely different kind of trajectory as far as the LGBTQ history and their acknowledgement of their existence or disacknowledgement of their existence. They're a non-Abrahamic religious kind of area, so they don't have those kind of religious influences we'd expect. Instead, what we see, though, is direct ideas and conceptualizations of transgenderism existing from their earliest religion, Taoism, or Taoism, depending on how you're pronouncing it. On the right over here is the Tao Te Ching. It is the kind of main textual, these are bamboo strips that are the main textual kind of evidence of their ideology and kind of founding of the religion. On the left here, we have the Taju Shu, which is their kind of conceptual idea of the universe and cosmology. The basic idea of it is that everything in the world and in existence is in a kind of transient existence, and everything can be shifted from one to another. The Tao Te Ching even mentions that yin can become yang and a man can transition into a woman. So even from the earliest kinds of religious and textual kind of evidence that we look at for China, we see direct influence or direct kind of examples of transgenderism. But we're going to jump ahead. We don't see a lot of transgender individuals specifically in a lot of the kind of ancient histories. A lot of historians have been in disagreement of this, and there's two basic ways of looking at it. Either transgender individuals were existed and accepted in society and were just acknowledged by their gender of choice. So if a person transgendered or changed their gender into the opposite gender, then society would just recognize them as that gender and they wouldn't appear as transgender in the records. Or the opposite of that, where they were not accepted by society and still referred to by their pre-transition gender. But we're going to get a major change in that in the 1935. This is Yao Zhiping. He was a very interesting individual and is kind of credited as being the first transgender person in China. Yao was born a woman, and it became kind of famous and known in 1935 because the story of Yao is basically his father joins the military, goes off to fight Japan, and then disappears. Yao becomes extremely stricken with grief, takes to a bed in their house and basically isolates. The house is then struck by lightning, and Yao receives a vision that says, wait 100 days and then emerge from the house as a man and you can go look for your father. Yao waits 100 days, emerges from the house, and says to Yao's grandfather, I'm a man, I want to join the military. And Yao's grandfather's like, this is a miracle, this is crazy, everyone needs to know. So gets a hold of reporters and it hits the news like crazy. Look at this miracle story about this amazing transformation. Then Yao was questioned by people being like, well, how is this possible? Well, that's kind of stuff. We need to have like the family doctor look at this person. So they have the family doctor inspect Yao. Yao refuses to undress, so the family doctor basically does a pat down inspection and finds that Yao does have male genitalia, although it is extremely disformed. And so they're like, it's a miracle, great. This hits the papers even more. There's a bit of delay in trying to get a hold of the military. During this time, the papers are talking to Yao's grandfather. Yao's grandfather's kind of speaking for Yao, but eventually the papers want to speak to Yao themselves. And Yao kind of, they begin to do interviews, and the papers are so impressed by Yao's kind of like speaking and the way he presents himself that they're like, well, we don't believe that you were ever a woman. Like, we believe that you were always a man and are pretending that you transitioned in this way. And so then it becomes the trick of Yao now having to prove that he was a woman at some point and uses the evidence of the pierced ears and the partially bound feet as evidence, and also the certificate from their graduation from a all women's boarding school. Um, the military then comes in and says, well, we need more inspections. We don't believe this story. We need to actually do real inspections. They do more inspections. Again, Yao refuses to undress. The military doesn't accept that. So then they're like, you need to have doctors inspect you. We can't actually have this going on. So during this time, Yao then is forced to undress, and they discover that Yao has been using basically an implement made of a rolled up silk blanket to impersonate male genitalia. And so a lot of doctors are like, oh, well, see, this is bogus now. We need to ignore this person. But there are several doctors, specifically one named Du He, who insisted, well, no, we need to look at this a different way. Yao was so good at impersonating a man, who are we to say that they are not one because of their genitalia? They have been living as a man for now more than a year. They've been showing incredible filial piety with wanting to go and search for their father. And they have now been even showing interest in women, and obviously women couldn't show interest in women. So these are all evidence that Yao is a true man despite their genitalia. This is a really big kind of debate that starts to begin in China. And it's really interesting in the way it happens, because I feel like it's still a debate we see a lot in transgender kind of groups now, where it's the idea of at what part of the process are you valid as a transgender person? Is it after your gender reaffirming surgery? It kind of is still an ongoing debate that we haven't figured out, and they were having it nearly almost 100 years before us. But Yao kind of disappears from the historical record. From what we can tell, continued to live as a man after this and did end up marrying somebody, but things get so chaotic in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in China that we just kind of lose track of where Yao is. This is a newspaper article. This is the one that was talking specifically about the magical transformation with the lightning. And there is pictures of Yao right there. If we move on to our second person, this is where it starts to get even more complex. Zi Xuan was a intersex person who was serving in the Nationalist Army in 1949, fighting against the communists. When the communists started taking over China, they fled to Taiwan, in which they were first outed as an intersex person by paper in 1953. This paper read, intersex person found in the military, sex to be determined by surgery. So while China was having their debates and kind of like discussions about Yao Jinping, Xi Jinping already had it decided by the doctors. It was already determined that their genitalia and their sex was completely determined on their, or their sex and their gender identity was completely determined on their genitalia. So Zeke agreed to go through with gender affirming care and basically be like, fine, let's get this taken care of. I want to go back to my life as a man. We can just continue on what I was doing. I can continue to be a veteran. I can still get my veterans benefits, and we can still just continue to live as the life that I already was. Because as an intersex person, they were already living as a man up until their kind of discovery in the military. However, there's one event that would be very unfortunate for Z and would change drastically the direction of their life. And that is the story of Christine Jorgensen. Christine Jorgensen was an American GI who was who, when coming back from World War II, traveled to Denmark in order to go through with gender affirming surgery and came back to the US living as a woman. Now, Christine was a huge celebrity. She was a performer, she was a singer, she was a dancer, she was a stage performer. She was the highlight of many different shows. She was both a extremely well-known performer for talents and for the oddity of being transgender. And because of this, Taiwan wanted their own Christine Jorgensen. They went even so far as to put out into the press that Xi Zhishuan would be known as the Chinese Christine. The doctors also had the realization that Xi's male genitalia was not as well functioning, but they did have working ovaries. And so against Xi Zhishuan's wishes, the doctors went through with gender affirming care to transition into female. The first 4 surgeries were against Xi's consent. They involved different sedation methods. They involved restraining methods. It was horrible. After the 6th surgery, Xi had decided to give up in the fight against it and continued to go through with the gender affirming surgery for becoming a woman. After 11 surgeries, with 2 of them being corrective surgeries for botched surgeries, Xi was officially recognized as a woman in Taiwan and, unsurprisingly, disappears from the historical record. Not much is known about what happens to Xi, as they very much did not want to be in the public light. They did not want to be the Chinese Christine. They didn't want to be that figure. Taiwan was so busy trying to push for this to also not only to prove their own like doctoral kind of like proficiencies, but also to show that Taiwan was on par with the rest of the Western world. The doctors talk a lot about how they need to prove themselves as equal to the rest of the US and Europe and prove that they are better than China and their fake transgender. But there is an upside to Xi's story, and that is it getting out and inspiring other transgender individuals in China. Liu Jindi is a 19-year-old that heard about Xi's story. She didn't hear specifically about any of the kind of back-going-ons about it or about the not wanting that surgery or anything, but simply heard about the Chinese Christine and was like, it's possible, I can do that too. Liu Jindi continued to live her life as a man during the day, but then at night would dress up as a woman. And basically, the way she describes it is practice on passing, is how it would best be described. She continued to do this for quite a while, except instead of keeping it late at night, would kind of roll back the time after every little bit of time. So late at night to late evening to early evening to then even sunset to even then late afternoon. Liu Jindi was caught by the police in 1950s, and the police didn't quite know what to do. They had charged her with impersonating of a opposite gender, but they didn't really have any kind of set like laws or kind of ways of handling it. There wasn't a precedent for it. And so it's not clear what punishment they gave Liu Jindi, But what is clear is that 2 months later, Liu Jindi was back on the streets practicing again. And many of the neighbors were talking about how happy they were to see Liu Jindi living the life that she was able to, even in the daytime.
All right, round of applause. Thank you so much. Questions for Lucas? Yes, John.
Honestly, like it's very unique and very catchy. Like I was very surprised also this. So this is my question. So how were you able to read and like read the Mandarin, the language?
So I've been reliant a lot on secondary sources. I know these are 2 papers and I can ballpark some of them, but not enough to accurately read it. I've been reliant a lot on like secondary sources and translators. And even getting the newspapers has been incredibly difficult because there's not very easy like compositories like we have for like English newspapers. Funny enough, I actually had to get this newspaper section from a Reddit post where somebody was in a archive and they're like, I found this paper from 1935 in I believe it was San Francisco or LA. And they're like, can anyone translate it? And it's a bunch of other scholars that have kind of worked on these like transgender issues and like specifically studying Yao, being like, where did you find this? Why do you have this? And so it's kind of a funny Reddit thread to read through, but that's actually where I got this one. This one was actually in from a secondary source that I was using. It's by Howard Chang, I want to say. I can get that to you later, but it's a secondary source, and they that author has a bunch of different kind of like images for the individuals they're talking about while they're talking about it. They also talked about a couple other transgender individuals near the late 50s, but I had to limit it to for time wise. So
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Other questions, Dr. Schiller?
I don't know if it's an impossible question,
Okay, we're.
but I'm gonna throw it out there anyway.
Okay.
And it has to do with Xi Jinping, whose story and whose experience seems to walk the line between the nationalist struggle for supremacy in China and the communists as well. And I'm wondering if you zoom out, was there any policies from the nationalists or the communists or even the Taiwanese where they end up about this experience? Or was it mainly a micro?
It
Story.
seems like it's very much a micro. It's very much. I picked these 3 individuals also because they represent 3 different times in Chinese history, and they're 3 different kind of Chinese, ethnically Chinese people living in very different politically situations, going through different challenges. The first one with the Qing Dynasty, near the end of the Qing Dynasty, the second one being Taiwan, and then the third one being Communist China. So we don't see any kind of like widespread issues, or I should say laws passed against transgender individuals specifically from these people, but there are things later on that kind of do affect that.
That's very interesting.
So the number one thing is like the sexual liberation movement we have in the US majorly affects Taiwan's kind of stance on sex and gender and all that kind of things, and they're very much taking kind of looks and playbooks from us.
Interesting.
There's also the British colonialization of Hong Kong that plays into effect until 2012 is when I believe they left. So there's a lot of kind of geopolitical shiftings going on that make it very difficult to say, well, is this because of this individual or is it because of a wider kind of thing going on?
Interesting, thank you.
Question.
I don't know.
Oh, yeah,
I know we're probably
Yeah.
back by the chair. I gotta raise my hand higher. Lucas, I really appreciated how you sort of grounded your presentation in Taoism and how this sort of like theoretical grounding might be different than what we expect in the US. So I was wondering, is the term transgender and transgenderism, right, are those also terms that are in use in China in this period, or are there other concepts that might?
So kind of and kind of not. The actual word that I used here means person who cut across gender. So that is the scholarly and academic way of wording this. It is not the term that transgender people over there use. There's a lot more kind of there's a lot more pushback against kind of LGBT people there. So what they're having to do is use a lot of different terminology to kind of get around the kind of like censorship and surveillance that's going on. And so we see a lot of kind of like shifting terminology. We see a lot of like shorthands, a lot of like double speak where they'll say one thing but mean another. There are generally the terms that I've tried to use are the more respectable ones, so the more scholarly ones. There's also a lot of, unfortunately, it's a lot easier to find slurs because they're a lot more out and open. So in like translated to English, like the term sissy boy for like a transgender woman is very common and very out in the open and much more frequently seen. But it's not a term that you would want to use respectfully to one of these individuals.
I'll ask the last question, Lucas. So, this is the middle part of a much longer project. You were kind of going back and forth about what part of this project to present to us. And so if you could select one fun fact from the first part, or kind of the most interesting thing, if you were to give us a totally different presentation on the first kind of third project, what was the most interesting kind of thing you would want to communicate there?
I had a really big kind of like aha moment because I kept reading about like the bisexuality of the Han Dynasty and how common it was, and how there was just so much
Han
kind of
Dynasty,
like
by the way, is like cool with the Roman Empire.
yeah, it's early, like just right around like 0 kind of year and that sort of thing. But there was so much bisexuality and like so well known and common, and like I was like, okay, well, what makes it different there than other times? And it was, they held an idea in that time of China and through a lot of Chinese history that bisexuality was not an identity, and LGBTQ things were not an identity like we see it today. It is instead a act that you are performing. So like if a man is sleeping with another man while he's married, that doesn't make him a bisexual person. That is not an identity to him. It's just what he's doing. It's just his action. And that kind of like aha click moment of like, oh, this idea of like identity is also a very individualistic and not Chinese idea. It's very much a kind of like Western idea.
Well, maybe. I mean, actually, I think you might be interested to look into Roman imperial ideas of
Mhm.
sexuality and how, because I suspect you might see some resonances there too as well.
Okay. Because it's very different from at least the LGBTQ that I'm familiar with today with our very focus on like personal identity.
Sure, absolutely, sure. It is very different.
And so that was kind of like a big aha moment, at least for me when studying it.
Okay, cool. It's always good to have those aha moments. All right, another round of applause. Thank you, Lucas.